With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Have you ever heard the tale of David Ingram, the first European to walk across North America? Well, technically he walked from Florida to Nova Scotia, and even that might not be true. Allow me to explain. In 1568, Ingram was an English privateer serving aboard a ship called the Minion, captained by the notorious English naval commander and slave trader John Hawkins. The Minion, along with a small flotilla of other privateers, were anchored off the coast of Mexico when they were surprised by the arrival of a fleet of Spanish warships. After some initial wrangling and bad faith negotiations, a battle broke out. The English ships got the worst of it. 4 of their 6 vessels were sunk by the Spanish. But the heavily damaged Minion just managed to make an escape. The ship limped along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico before eventually being run aground on the west coast of Florida. The surviving crew were put ashore and told to fend for themselves. David Ingram and his 2 shipmates, Richard Brown and Richard Twide, or the 2 Dickies, as I like to call them, were among these stranded sailors. So they decided to head north in hopes of finding an English settlement somewhere along the route. What followed was nothing short of an odyssey. Ingram would later report to writers back in England that his small entourage traveled through the most amazing countries, encountered many dangers, and saw the most marvelous things. Somewhere north of Florida, the 3 men were captured by a group that Ingram called the Gazika. The English traveler claimed that the Gazika typically wore, quote, rubies being 6 inches long and 2 inches broad, end quote. The rulers of this kingdom were apparently carried aloft on a, quote, sumptuous chair of silver and crystal, end quote. These ruby-clad indigenous people apparently stripped Ingram and his companions naked so that they might better examine their strange pale skin. After being released, the men traveled north, where they moved through many large cities, some of which were richly decorated with silver ornaments. Further on, the travelers saw many incredible beasts. Ingram was particularly amazed by a large furry creature with tusks that was the, quote, natural enemy of the horse, end quote. So what was this tusked horse eater? Well, it's hard to say, but it was definitely not an elephant, because later on in the text, Ingram describes seeing an elephant. Now, I don't mean that he describes an animal that might be mistaken for an elephant. The report of his journey matter-of-factly says, quote, he did also see in that country elephants, end quote. So that's both tusked horse eaters and elephants hanging out, I don't know, somewhere in Virginia, I guess? After a year making their way through this wonderland we now call the eastern seaboard of the United States, the 3 shipmates eventually found their way to Cape Breton Island in the north part of Nova Scotia. There they managed to procure a canoe from some friendly local folks and paddled the coast before they were picked up by a French ship and taken back to Europe. It would take 13 years before Ingram's amazing tale was properly recorded. The sailor was likely illiterate, So while he did not commit these recollections to paper, he may have been dining out on these stories in pubs in his hometown of Barking, which is just east of London. Clearly enough people had heard of his New World exploits that he eventually caught the attention of two very important people. One was Sir George Peckham, an ambitious English merchant and an advocate for the expansion of English colonies in the New World. The other was the influential secretary to Queen Elizabeth I, Francis Walsingham. In 1582, these two men tracked down Ingram and had him relate the story of his long walk for posterity. These two men were deeply involved in the promotion of England's early empire. At the time, England had only a very modest presence in the New World. She was also on the verge of an all-out war with Spain, who by the late 1500s had made a claim to nearly half the planet. The English were looking for historical precedents that could justify their own claims to the Americas and beyond. Perhaps David Ingram's experiences traversing the land between Florida and Canada could help support English colonial ambitions. And interestingly enough, something Ingram told them seemed to do exactly that. And weirdly, it had to do with penguins. Now, a penguin in what is today Virginia is frankly just as strange as an elephant. But in 1582, the word penguin had a different meaning than how we use it today. There may have been a number of different birds that in the 1500s were called penguins. Well, David Ingram told his interviewers that the birds that he saw had, quote, the shape of a goose, but their wings have callow feathers, and they cannot fly. They have white heads, and therefore the countrymen call them penguins, end quote. You see, it was those white heads that made them penguins. Why, do you ask? Well, if you are speaking Welsh and you want to say white head, you would use the words pen and gwyn. Penguin. Now, why on earth would any indigenous group in North America use a Welsh word to describe a white-headed bird? Well, these early English empire builders had the answer. Clearly, the Welsh had arrived in North America centuries before any other Europeans. These early Welsh settlers had mixed with various indigenous groups and had created a new people. Amazingly, over the centuries, this group continued speaking Welsh. It was believed by many that these early Welsh pioneers had been led to North America in the year 1170 by a Welsh royal named Prince Madoc. The story went that Madoc was one of the younger sons of the Welsh king Owain Gwynedd. He apparently fled across the Atlantic to avoid a bloody succession dispute after the death of his father. If some traditions are to be believed, Madoc may have made as many as 3 trips between Wales and the New World, transporting hundreds of Welsh colonists in the process. If this was true, then that would mean that Madoc had beat Columbus to the New World by a solid 3 centuries. But was there any evidence of this beyond David Ingram's strange observation about penguins? It's hard to take that source seriously, given Ingram's other tales about elephants and kings with crystal thrones. But while Ingram was the first European to report an encounter with Welsh-speaking indigenous people, he would be far from the last. Remarkably, there are at least 93 known accounts of travelers meeting First Nation groups throughout North America who reportedly understood and spoke Welsh. These reports of a lost Welsh tribe date from the 1580s right up through the early 1800s. How exactly should we account for all of those stories? Were there really entire tribes living in North America who spoke Welsh as their first language? Who was this Prince Madoc? Is there any evidence that a transatlantic voyage embarked from Wales in the 12th century? Should we be rethinking the history of first contact between the hemispheres? Let's see what we can figure out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 239. Did a Welsh prince speak Columbus to the New World? Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone listening that you can hear this episode ad-free by supporting this show at $5 or more every month on Patreon. That will get you an ad-free feed and a boatload of extra episodes. And speaking of extras, voting is now underway for the next patrons-only extra. At the moment, the Norse presence in North America is currently the topic with the most votes, but only a fraction of the patrons have yet to weigh in. So if you want to join our democracy, vote for your favorite topic, and then get exclusive access to that show once it is complete, then please head over to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and find the level of support that works for you. I've said it before, and I will say it again, this show would not exist if it were not for the support of the listeners. So if you dig what you are hearing, then the best way to show your love is to become a patron. I also want to remind everyone that we are going to Greece in 2026. If you want to join me on an adventure through Greece and the Greek islands, then head to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links for the full itinerary. It's going to be incredible. The holidays are coming up. If you want to surprise the Our Fake History fan in your life with the most amazing gift ever, consider sending them to Greece with me. You can also find a link in the show notes that will take you directly to the spot where you can book. And if you book, don't forget to use the code OFH so they know that I sent you. This week, we are turning our attention to the always controversial question of who completed the world's first transatlantic voyage. This has proved to be a perennial concern on this podcast. And if the Patreon voting keeps trending in the direction it's going right now, the next patrons-only show might also deal with this contested historical first. But setting aside the voyages of the Vikings, which I may be unpacking in detail very soon, there have been a whole slew of other people who have been credited with arriving in North America before Christopher Columbus. Now, of course, I am not referring to the true first people of North and South America. I know I've said this a million times on the podcast, but it's never a bad thing to remind everyone that the best evidence now suggests that the ancestors of the Western Hemisphere's First Nations arrived between 20 and 30,000 years ago. So if we're talking about historical firsts, it's not even a competition. There's a reason why we call them the indigenous people. They've been here for tens of thousands of years. The question that has inspired the real historical speculation is whether or not any non-Indigenous person reached the Americas before Christopher Columbus. Over the years, we have examined the pseudo-historical theory that the Chinese may have visited North America during the Ming Dynasty. We've looked at sources that hint that the brother of the famous Malian king, Mansa Musa, took a fleet of African vessels across the Atlantic in the early 1300s. We've also looked at theories involving corruptions of the myth of the Mexica god Quetzalcoatl and his journeys over the ocean. But one of the more curious pre-1492 contact hypotheses is the idea that a group of colonists from medieval Wales, led by one Prince Madoc, landed somewhere in the Americas in the year 1170. The belief in an early wave of Welsh colonization was taken fairly seriously by many Britons and Americans for around 400 years. Apparently, if you visit Mobile, Alabama today, you can still find a plaque in a courtyard of a small local museum that reads, quote, "In memory of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer who landed on the shores of Mobile Bay in 1170 and left behind, with the Indians, the Welsh language," end quote. The plaque was originally erected on Mobile Point by the nonprofit group The Daughters of the American Revolution, where it announced this unbelievable historical fact from the early 1950s until it was knocked down by a hurricane in 1979. For decades, average people strolling along Mobile Point were being told by a very official-looking historical plaque that colonists from medieval Wales had not only sailed across the Atlantic, they had made the implausible journey south around Florida to finally settle on Alabama's Gulf Coast. Now, how exactly did we get to the spot where, as late as the 1950s, the Daughters of the American Revolution felt like they needed to erect a historical plaque emblazoned with Welsh flags? Well, the plaque itself gives us an important clue. You see, from the late 1500s through to the mid-19th century, colonists from Britain kept encountering indigenous people who they claimed could speak Welsh. Some Welsh travelers even reported that their lives had been saved after a group of once hostile native people heard them speak a few words from their mother tongue. The ancient language of West Britain had somehow been adopted by America's first people. Or at least, so goes the tale. These travelers' stories of encounters with Welsh-speaking groups, often called Welsh Indians by the sources, present a bit of a historical puzzle. Could it have been possible for a Welsh prince and a band of colonists to reach North America in the 12th century? If not, then how do we explain all these encounters with Welsh-speaking native people? Well, let's start by digging into the tale of Prince Madoc and see what we can figure out. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Rula. Taking care of your mental health shouldn't be harder than taking care of your physical health. If you pull a muscle, go see a doctor. But when it comes to finding the right therapist, suddenly it's frustrating. You've got long wait lists, or you're staring down a huge out-of-pocket cost. That's what usually stops people from getting help. That's where Rula comes in. Rula makes therapy simple, affordable, and fast. They work with most major insurance plans, and the average session copay is just $15. $15. That's basically the cost of lunch, but instead of a sandwich, you're investing in your own headspace. Getting started couldn't be easier. You answer a few quick questions about what matters to you, and Rula connects you with in-network providers who actually fit your needs. You pick the time, and you could be talking to a therapist as soon as the next day. No weeks of waiting, no endless back and forth. Thousands of people have already used Rula to finally get the care they need. Don't keep putting it off. Go to rula.com/fakehistory and get started today. That's RULA.com/fakehistory. Take the first step. Get connected and take control of your mental health. Today's episode of Our Fake History is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey, listeners, whether you love true crime or comedies, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options. Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. To understand why people started reporting encounters with indigenous Welsh speakers in the New World, we need to start in Wales. In the 12th century, the Welsh had not yet come under the thumb of their English neighbors. There were a few independent Welsh kingdoms, the largest of which was Gwynedd, in what is today the north of Wales. From 1137 to 1170, the king of Gwynedd was a man named Owain ap Gruffydd, sometimes called Owain Gwynedd, in honor of the kingdom that he ruled. And apologies to all the Welsh listeners out there. I'm doing my best with these Welsh pronunciations. It's tricky, as you may know. Now, King Owain is one of the better remembered medieval Welsh kings. He was an aggressive military leader who tangled with King Henry II of England. He was also the first leader that we know of to style himself as both King of Wales and Prince of the Welsh. He lived during an era of big personalities who have become perennial podcast favorites. We're talking King Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard the Lionheart, and Louis VII of France. King Owain seems to have been just as formidable as all of these famous names. But when the king died in 1170, a succession crisis broke out in Gwynedd. Owain had had 2 different marriages over which he fathered at least 5 legitimate sons, all of whom felt like they had a claim to the throne. On top of that, it seems like Owain had a number of illegitimate children who, under Welsh law, apparently could claim some type of inheritance. What's clear is that after the death of King Owain, Gwynedd was plunged into a civil war as the sons of the late king tried to press their claim to the throne. It's in this context that we get the tale of Prince Madoc. Madoc was, allegedly, one of Owain's illegitimate sons. But unlike his brothers, he had almost no interest in pursuing the throne. The story goes that Madoc decided that Wales had simply become far too dangerous, especially for someone carrying the blood of the king. So, the prince rounded up a group of a few hundred followers and set sail from his native Wales in search of a new home, one that was not riven by war. This group, led by Madoc, voyaged west and eventually found that home. The most detailed account of Madoc's voyage was recounted by the Welsh historian Humphrey Lloyd in his landmark History of Wales, published in 1558. Here's how Lloyd presented the story. Quote, Madoc, another of Owain Gwyneth's sons, left the land in contention betwixt his brethren, and prepared certain ships with men and munitions, and sought adventures by sea, sailing west and leaving the coast of Ireland so far north that he came to a land unknown, where he saw many strange things. This land must needs be some part of that country of which the Spaniards affirm themselves to be the first finders. For, by reason and order of cosmography, this land, to which Madoc came, must need be some part of Nova Hispania, or Florida. Whereupon it is manifest that that country was long before by Britons discovered, before either Columbus or Americus Vespucius led any Spaniards thither. And after he had returned home and declared the pleasant and fruitful countries that he had seen without inhabitants, this Madoc, arriving in that western country on to which he came in the year 1170, left most of his people there, and returning back for more of his own nation to inhabit that fair and large country, went thither again with 10 sails. I am of opinion that that land, whereunto he came, was some part of Mexico. End quote. Now, I hope you forgive the long quote, but there's some pretty juicy stuff in there. Now, I'm sure there are some of you listening going, wait, Sebastian, hold the phone. Did you say that history was published in 1558? I mean, doesn't that seem kind of late for a source dealing with events from the 12th century? Well, you would be right. It is late. You might have also noticed that that particular passage was filled with 16th century concerns. The author goes out of his way to underscore the fact that it was a Briton who made it to the New World first. He specifically calls out Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci as being latecomers, and in doing so calls into question the legitimacy of Spain's New World acquisition. He even goes so far as to claim that Madoc made his final landing in Mexico. That's a pretty wild place to end up if you started your journey in Ireland and then headed north, which is what the source tells us. Now, you don't need to be an especially sophisticated reader to pick up on the motives behind this particular framing of the Prince Madoc tale. The author spells it right out. Whatever the Spanish might be telling you, they did not discover the New World. The real discoverer was an obscure Welsh prince, which in 1558 meant that Queen Elizabeth I actually had the best claim to what was wrongfully being called New Spain. Humphrey Lloyd's version of the Prince Madoc story was soon picked up by other Elizabethan imperialists, excited by its implications for England's fledgling overseas empire. The famous astrologer, alchemist, and spy John Dee, a man sometimes credited with first using the term British Empire, cited the story of Prince Madoc in his 1580 tract, The Title Royal. Dee, who I will definitely do an entire episode on one day, claimed that Madoc's voyage was not only well affirmed by historical documents, but made the English the natural colonial overlords of North America. In 1583, Sir George Peckham published his book featuring the Odyssey of David Ingram and his curious tale of Welsh-speaking indigenous people and their white-headed penguins. Then in 1589, the historian Richard Hakluyt published his widely read history of English colonization titled The Principal Navigations, Voyages, and Discoveries of the English Nation. In it, he reproduced Humphrey Lloyd's account of the Prince Madoc tale and argued that the Welsh adventurer was the first European to arrive in the New World. All of this meant that by the turn of the 17th century, the story of Madoc and his 1170 voyage was well known in England. In fact, Madoc's voyage became a point of pride for many patriotic Elizabethans. But where exactly had the Welsh historian Humphrey Lloyd got the story of Prince Madoc from in the first place? Had anyone heard of Madoc before 1558? It turns out that's a hard question to answer. We can say with certainty that if there was a Madoc, he was an especially obscure son of King Owain. None of the genealogies or histories produced before the 16th century seem to mention him. However, experts have found references to someone, or possibly multiple people, named Madoc from the 12th century. These Madocs often pop up in Welsh poems, sometimes referred to as the bardic sources. That is, history as recorded by the bards, the traditional storytellers and poets of Wales. There is one poem from the 12th century that speaks of a person named Madoc giving, quote, kindly apportioned gifts to an unnamed king. The most suggestive line comes from a poem written as an elegy for King Owain. That line has been translated as, quote, is not Madoc dead by the overwhelming wrath of seas? End quote. Well, this is interesting because it gives us a Madoc in the 12th century, and there's a reference to him going to sea, albeit dying at sea. But many experts believe that line is a mistranslation of the original Welsh. The same passage has also been translated as, quote, Madoc, the bulwark of swelling rage, was slain, end quote. So we have a dead Madoc here, but the suggestive reference to the ocean is now taken out. So while we do have some references in poetry to a Welsh Madoc from the 12th century, those references don't tell us much. Madoc was a fairly common name in medieval Wales, so it's deeply unclear if the Madocs in these poems were the same guy as the seafaring hero. The earliest hint we have about a ocean-going Prince Madoc comes from scattered references to a romance written in Flemish by a 13th century poet named Willem the Minstrel. Now, unfortunately, this text has been lost, but according to the Madoc expert Gwyn Williams, references to a quote-unquote Madoc romance that was written sometime around 1250 have been found in a few medieval texts. All we know about this supposed medieval romance is that the titular Madoc came from Wales and sailed to an island paradise where he planned to, quote, launch a new kingdom of love and music, end quote. Unfortunately, the extant sources don't give us anything else, but Gwyn Williams' research at least suggests that there was a legendary tradition about a Welsh seafarer named Madoc that existed around the mid-1200s. The next time the name Madoc appears in any source is 200 years later in a poem by the Welsh poet Marath ap Rhys. This poem, which was written around the 1470s, speaks of, quote, splendid Madoc of great countenance, proper scion of Owain Gwynedd. He did not desire land, he was my inspiration, nor great wealth other than the seas." End quote. All right, so here we are, a solid 300 years after Prince Madoc allegedly landed in North America, and we finally have a source that brings most of the pieces of the puzzle together. As far as we know, this is the first reference we have to a seafaring Prince Madoc who was the son of King Owain. But that's it. That's everything we can find about an ocean-going Prince Madoc before the Elizabethans wrote their pro-empire version of the tale in the late 1500s. All of this is to say that the documentary evidence for the voyage of Prince Madoc is basically non-existent. There are only the faintest hints that King Owain even had a son named Madoc. Even in those later sources that suggest that there was a well-known tale of a Welsh Madoc sailing the seas, none of those sources mention anything remotely close to this adventurer finding his way to North America. But you should know that the medieval documentary evidence for the voyage of Prince Madoc was never what made the story compelling. The thing about documentary evidence is that there's always a chance that something has been lost. It's possible that those Elizabethan writers had access to sources that have since disappeared. It's also very possible that those Elizabethan writers goosed up a fairly flimsy tradition about a Welsh sailor to help England's colonial ambitions. But in either case, the Madoc tradition would probably have been left in the 1500s had it not been for persistent reports of colonists encountering indigenous people who spoke Welsh. Now, as I already mentioned, the earliest known report of this type comes from 1582. That was the account from the marooned sailor David Ingram, who swore that he had heard some unidentified group of people call a white-headed bird a penguin. In the report, this curious occurrence is presented matter-of-factly. Of course they would be speaking Welsh. Why wouldn't they be? The next known report of this sort comes from a few decades later, in 1608. This strange encounter happened near the Jamestown colony in Virginia. Now, as all my real history heads know, this was the time and place where Pocahontas and the ne'er-do-well English colonist John Smith had their own legendary encounter. And sure enough, one of our key sources for this is John Smith's History of the Colony of Virginia. Smith tells us that in November of 1608, the English made an expedition up the James River into the territory of a people known as the Monacan. The Monacan spoke a different language from many of the neighboring groups, including the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, with whom the English had predominantly interacted. One of the men on this expedition was a newly arrived officer named Captain Peter Wynne, who just so happened to be Welsh. He would later report in a letter back to England that, quote, "The people of the Monacan speak a language far different from the subjects of Powhatan, their pronunciation being very much like Welsh, so that the gentlemen in our company desired me to be their interpreter." End quote. Because the language sounded vaguely Welsh, this Welsh person was nominated to be an interpreter. Now, I'm sure you're asking, how did it go? Well, by all accounts, not very well. Very little communication seems to have occurred between the Welsh Captain Wynne and the Monacan people. It's almost like they were speaking two different languages. The English did not manage to trade with this group, and since the Monacan had wisely hidden all their food and valuables before the party arrived, the colonists couldn't even steal anything. After the expedition, John Smith reported, quote, "We arrived back at Jamestown half sick, all complaining and tired with toil, famine, and discontent." End quote. This excursion to the territory of the Monacan had been a bust. But despite that fact, this reference to the Monacans pronouncing their words in a way that sounded Welsh has been pointed to as evidence that this group had some ancient contact with Prince Madoc and his colonists. It also helps that the name Monacan sounds tantalizingly close to Madocian. Could their name have been a reference to a legendary Welsh ancestor? Well, probably not. We now know that the Monacan people spoke a language known as Tutelo, which is related to the Sioux language group. But this encounter in Virginia would not be the last report of an indigenous language sounding Welsh to British colonists. The next well-known example we have of this comes from a few decades later, in 1669. This is the account of Reverend Morgan Jones. The Reverend was a Welsh clergyman who was traveling with a group of colonists from Virginia to South Carolina when the company was captured by a group from the Tuscarora Nation, known as the Doeg. The Reverend tells his leader that the Doeg were upset to learn that the company planned to move through their territory on their way to Roanoke. After a night in captivity, the Reverend reported, quote, "The next day they entered in consultation with us, which after it was over, the interpreter told us that we needed to prepare ourselves to die the next morning." End quote. In a moment of despair, the Reverend shouted out in his Welsh mother tongue, quote, "Have I escaped so many dangers, and I now must be knocked on the head like a dog?" End quote. This exclamation got the attention of a Doeg warrior, who seemingly understood the Welshman. The man approached the Reverend and told him in perfect Welsh that he would not be killed after all. Clearly, if he spoke the language of the people, he could not be an enemy. From there, we are told that the Doeg released the captives and treated them as honored guests. The Reverend spoke at length with the Doeg chief in their shared language and even preached the gospel to an attentive audience in Welsh. The account of the Reverend Morgan Jones would go on to be published and reprinted dozens of times. It became a favorite of magazine publishers and would turn up in various English publications like The Gentleman's Magazine throughout the 1700s. The Jones encounter would also create a template for many of the future tales of so-called Welsh Indians. Jones's story was satisfying because it had dramatic stakes and incorporated elements of what were known as captivity narratives. This was an emerging genre of often fictionalized accounts of people escaping the clutches of indigenous groups. Many future accounts would follow the details of Jones's encounter quite closely. But what of Jones's tale itself? Can it be believed? Gwyn Williams, one of the foremost experts of the Madoc tradition, has pointed out that no one was ever able to confirm Jones's story. We now know that the Tuscarora spoke an Iroquoian language. The Doeg are actually a group that have nothing to do with the Tuscarora, so right off the bat we have a strange misidentification. No one else ever encountered this particular Welsh-speaking subset of the Tuscarora people. In the opinion of Gwyn Williams, the account of Reverend Jones was, quote, "a complete farrago and may have been intended as a hoax, end quote. If it was a hoax, then it proved to be a shockingly effective one. One of the best-known stories that seems to mirror Reverend Jones's tale came from a man named Maurice Griffin. Maurice Griffin was a Welshman who allegedly encountered a hostile group of Shawnee while on an expedition up the Missouri River in 1764. Like Jones, he and his group were about to be executed when Maurice addressed his captors in Welsh. The amazed Shawnee understood him perfectly and decided to spare his life. But already we're beginning to see the difficulty with these stories. In every encounter, it's always a different group of indigenous people from a different part of the continent who allegedly speak Welsh. In 1766, just 2 years after Maurice Griffin's experience, we have an account by one Reverend Charles Beatty, who presented some hearsay that he gathered from a Pennsylvania farmer named John Miller. John Miller apparently told him that, quote, when he was with the Choctaw Nation at the Mississippi, he went to an Indian town a very considerable distance from New Orleans, whose inhabitants were of different complexions, not so tawny as those other Indians, and who spoke Welsh. He said that he saw a book among them, which he supposed was a Bible, which they kept carefully wrapped up in a skin, but they could not read it, end quote. Now, that particular account was notable because it added an element to the lore about this lost Welsh tribe. This was the ancient Bible written in 12th century Welsh. This lost Bible would become a recurring motif in many future accounts. So, were the Choctaw the actual descendants of Prince Madoc's colonists? Already, just on this podcast, we've had stories about the Monacan, the Doeg, the Tuscarora, and the Shawnee also speaking Welsh. There was simply no consistency when it came to who these Welsh speakers actually were. But by the late 1700s, the sheer number of these stories started to convince many people that there had to be a Welsh-speaking group living somewhere in America. The famous frontiersman Daniel Boone was on record saying that he believed that a group of Welsh speakers lived somewhere in the American West. Even President Thomas Jefferson thought that it was likely that Madoc's descendants were somewhere in America. As late as 1979, the expert Gwyn Williams confessed to a journalist that he was a bit flummoxed by the huge number of stories that detailed encounters with indigenous Welsh speakers. He was quoted saying, quote, "You can't explain that away. All those stories. I am skeptical, highly skeptical. Yet there are 93 documented instances of people claiming to have directly spoken in Welsh to native people. For God's sake, they can't all be liars or maniacs." End quote. This is a paradox for any responsible historian. If you have 93 documented instances of anything, that needs to be taken seriously. But myths have a way of reproducing. Eventually, Williams found himself sorting through so many repetitive, contradictory, and unsubstantiated stories that soon he was entertaining the idea that, quote, perhaps they were all liars and maniacs, end quote. Oh man, dude, I know your struggle. But in the late 18th century, people were not quite ready to accept that as a possibility. This was especially true of a growing group of Welsh nationalists for whom Madoc's lost tribe represented something significant. It was a sad fact of history that much of Welsh identity, culture, and history had been repressed by colonialism. It only followed that a Welsh voyage to the New World had been similarly overlooked. There were some who believed that Welsh pride demanded that this tribe of Welsh speakers be located, identified, and properly acknowledged. So, let's pause there. And when we come back, we'll talk about the last great hunt for Madoc's North American descendants. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Homes.com. If you've ever been in the market for a new home, you know home shopping can be a lot. There's so much you don't know and so much you need to know. What are the neighborhoods like? What are the schools like? Who's the agent who knows the listing or neighborhood best? And why can't all this information just be in one place? Well, now it is on Homes.com. They've got everything you need to know about the listing itself, but even better, they've got comprehensive neighborhood guides and detailed reports about local schools. And their agent directory helps you see the agent's current listings and sales history. Homes.com collaboration tools make it easier than ever to share all this information with your family. It's a whole cul-de-sac of home shopping information all at your fingertips. Homes.com. We've done your homework. So, about a year ago, I decided that I was going to try and get a bit healthier. I started being a bit more conscious about my diet. I started exercising more. And you know what? It started to work. I'm feeling pretty good these days. In my quest to get more vitamins and minerals into my diet, I gave AG1 a try. And I have to say, I enjoy it. AG1 has 5 probiotic strains and more than 75 vitamins and minerals in each serving. And what I appreciate about AG1 is they actually seem to test their product. In an industry where not everyone invests heavily in research, they go to great lengths to continually invest in rigorous, peer-reviewed clinical trials. I also appreciate that AG1 actually tastes good. They got a bunch of new delicious flavors, including tropical, berry, and citrus, in addition to the original. So if you want to try it, head to drinkag1.com/fake and get a free welcome kit, including a bottle of vitamin D and free AG1 travel packs when you first subscribe. That's drinkag1.com/fake. When the Prince Madoc tradition was initially revived, some might say invented, in the mid-1500s, it was primarily of interest to English empire builders. If Prince Madoc's story was true, then it was believed that it gave the Queen of England an especially ancient claim to the New World. That assumption tells us quite a lot about the relationship between Wales and England during the Elizabethan era. It was taken for granted that the English monarch was the natural inheritor of any colonies established by a prince from the once independent Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd. These supposed Welsh achievements had been neatly folded into the English understanding of history. But as time went on and England became more firmly established as the ascendant European imperial power during the 18th century, interest in the Madoc legend among the English seems to have waned. England no longer needed a flimsy precedent set by a mythical Welsh prince to justify their increasingly global empire. But, ironically, in the late 1700s, the Prince Madoc story was taken up by a group of people looking to pull away from the British Empire. This was a clique of Welsh poets, artists, and intellectuals living in London in the 1790s. This group of Welshmen had dedicated themselves to reviving the Welsh language, celebrating the achievements of ancient Welsh poets, and kindling a renewed sense of Welsh national identity amongst their countrymen. This group was known as the Society of Gwenlligion. And again, apologies, Gwenlligion. I think I got that right. Anyway, the founding members notably set aside their English-sounding birth names and redubbed themselves with traditional Welsh monikers. Founding President Owen Jones became Owain Miffyr. Perhaps the most famous member of this group was Edward Williams, who became better known as Iolo Morganwg. Iolo Morganwg was an antiquarian who spent his life collecting medieval manuscripts written in ancient Brittonic languages. He was hugely influential in the revival of Welsh and the preservation of important Welsh historical records. He also did much to revive interest in the ancient religion of the Druids, which eventually led to the birth of the so-called Neo-Druid movement in the 19th century. But his zeal for Welsh identity led him towards some fairly shady academic practices. After his death, it was revealed that a number of the works that he credited to early medieval Welsh bards were actually forgeries of his own creation. He also had a habit of tweaking, some would say tampering with, legitimate ancient Brittonic texts so that they better suited his particular vision of Welsh identity. Well, sure enough, Iolo was deeply interested in the story of Prince Madoc, and in the 1790s, he claimed to have discovered a 12th century Welsh poem that spoke of, quote, Madoc, son of Owain, who went to sea with 300 men in 10 ships, and it is not known what place they went, end quote. At the time, this was considered strong historical evidence in favor of the Madoc tradition. While Iolo's recently discovered bardic source did not speak of a landing in the New World, it at least connected Madoc to King Owain and made it clear that he went to sea with 300 colonists. Now, this was significant for Iolo and his group of Welsh nationalists in London because they had started dreaming not only of an independent Wales, but of a new Welsh state in North America. You see, this group of London-based Welsh intellectuals were romantics in the classic sense of the word. They were also utopians. They liked the idea of creating a new Wales that would be entirely free of English influence and would have a culture based on their specific understanding of the ancient Welsh past. At one point, it seemed like this neo-Welsh utopia might be more feasible in North America than, actual Wales. The Madoc story and the tales of the Welsh-speaking indigenous groups provided a basis for this project. If this lost Welsh tribe could be located, then it was hoped that their territory might form the nucleus of what they hoped would be New Wales. Now, everyone involved knew that this was a bit of a pipe dream, and it's debatable how serious this London group was about starting a new Welsh republic. But it's very clear that Iolo, in particular, became enamored with the idea of finding the lost Welsh tribe. Even if the new Welsh utopia didn't work out, finding the lost tribe would be proof of Wales' importance in the history of the world. So, this group in London set about raising money for an expedition to find Madoc's tribe in America. By the 1790s, conventional wisdom had it that the true Welsh tribe were a group known as the Mandan. It was believed that those early encounters with Welsh speakers in Virginia and South Carolina had been legitimate, but that Madoc's descendants had since been pushed west. It was believed that they had now settled somewhere near the headwaters of the Missouri River in what is today North Dakota. The group of people who called that territory home were the Mandan, who some observers insisted were unique when compared to other indigenous groups from the region. It was suggested that the Mandan had lighter skin than other indigenous folks. They also used a specific type of riverboat that some people believed looked quite a lot like a Welsh riverboat, known as a coracle. The Mandan language also sounded distinct when compared to other tongues spoken in the region. Some thought it sounded kind of Welsh. The plan was to find and make contact with the Mandan. But the London group wasn't able to get much cash together for this ambitious journey. Eventually, Iolo Morganwg decided that he personally was not up for what was sure to be a taxing expedition. But this was not before he had connected with a spirited young Welshman named John Evans. In 1791, Evans arrived in big city London, having just left his hometown in Wales for the first time. He was 21 years old, impressionable, and deeply inspired by this group of Welsh luminaries that he quickly fell in with. He was a kid thirsty for adventure and fired up by the idea of a Welsh Renaissance. So he agreed to take on the task of finding this long-lost Welsh tribe. When he left for America, he was under the impression that Iolo Morganwg was eventually going to join him there. But that did not happen. Instead, young John Evans went on his own New World odyssey. When he arrived in St. Louis in 1793, it seems like he had no idea how provocative a Welshman claiming to be searching for the Welsh-speaking Mandan tribe in the upper Missouri truly was. St. Louis, and all of the Louisiana territory at the time, was controlled by the Spanish, who were deeply suspicious of the British Empire. At that time, the British had been challenging the Spanish claims to the northern part of the territory. John Evans, with his curious story about hunting for Welsh speakers upriver, seemed an awful lot like a British spy. So, the Spanish authorities promptly threw him in jail. It's unclear exactly how long he was imprisoned, but it could have been as long as 2 years. When Evans was eventually released, he remained remarkably committed to finding the Mandan. But he was also broke and looking for work. So, hoping to kill two birds with one stone, he got a job with a trading expedition operating under the auspices of the Spanish crown that was going to head upriver. You gotta love the frontier. You can go from being a prisoner to a trade representative pretty darn quick. Anyway, John Evans ventured as far as the territory of the Omaha Nation with this trading group before breaking off to go it on his own to find the Mandan. This led him through Sioux territory, where he was nearly killed by a group of Sioux warriors, unimpressed that Evans and his scrappy group of hangers-on were trespassing. But his hair's breadth escape did not deter him. After reconvening with his old trading party, he set out once again up the Missouri River. Eventually, he made contact with the Mandan. And the Mandan were an interesting people. First, they were gracious hosts who welcomed Evans into their community. Unlike many of their neighbors, they were not a strictly nomadic people, and instead lived in semi-permanent settlements. Evans stayed amongst the Mandan for 6 months, traded with them, ate with them, absorbed their customs, even played music with them. In many ways, the meeting was a triumph. He was one of only a handful of Europeans who had ever successfully made contact with this group of people. But despite all of John Evans' hopes, nothing about the Mandan seemed Welsh. While perhaps they had slightly lighter skin than some of their neighbors, they did not look typically European. Their culture was quite similar to that of the Sioux. They did not have a secret Welsh Bible. The Mandan had never heard of Prince Madoc. And most importantly, they did not speak Welsh. In fact, over the course of his long journey, he had met many indigenous people, and none of them had spoken Welsh. After all of this, Evans would eventually write back to his Welsh compatriots in London that, quote, "Thus, having explored and charted the Missouri for 1,800 miles, and by my communications with the Indians this side of the Pacific Ocean from 35 to 49 degrees latitude, I am able to inform you that there is no such people as the Welsh Indians." End quote. Now, you would think that John Evans' death-defying journey and half a year living with the Mandan would finally close the book on the question of a lost Welsh tribe. But many, especially that group of Welsh nationalists in London, simply did not want to accept Evans' conclusion. All of a sudden, Evans' youth and inexperience were brought up as reasons why he could not be trusted. Morgan John Rhys, a well-known Welsh patriot, loudly dismissed John Evans. He was annoyed that Madoc's lost tribe had been written off by a kid who, quote, "only by superficial research declares he cannot find them," end quote. Back in London, the Welsh group shrugged off Evans' report, arguing that the young man simply had not traveled far enough. They had all decided that the Welsh tribe was actually a 3-month journey from St. Louis, whereas the Mandan were located only some 68 days upriver. If only John Evans had just kept going, surely then he would have found Madoc's people. The existence of this lost Welsh tribe had become a matter of faith for this group of Welsh nationalists. Evidence to the contrary was simply dismissed. But the truth of the whole proposition was built on the shifting sands of myth and forgeries. Sure enough, it turns out that 12th century poem that so convinced the Welsh group that the Madoc tradition was real was just another fabrication cooked up by the fabricator-in-chief, Iolo Morganwg. But belief in the Welsh tribe would linger for at least the next half-century. It would eventually take the work of another Welsh scholar to properly discredit the Prince Madoc story. In 1858, the famous Welsh historian and literary critic Thomas Stevens published a thorough examination of all the evidence for the journey of Prince Madoc. He clearly demonstrated that all the mentions of Madoc's sea journey from before the 1500s were based on mistranslations of the original Welsh poems. There was only a shred of evidence that King Owain had a son named Madoc, even less that that person was known for sailing, and absolutely no evidence that he took hundreds of settlers to North America. Such was Stephen's standing among Welsh intellectuals that after the publication of his paper, the belief in the Madoc journey soon died out in Wales. But the belief in a lost Welsh tribe persisted in America, and the myth steadily grew. You see, from the moment that the Madoc story emerged in its fullest form in the 16th century, it had always been politically useful. First, it was useful to English imperialists looking to undercut Spanish claims to the Western Hemisphere. Then it was useful to Welsh nationalists who, in their zeal to revive an identity that itself had been suppressed by imperialism, glommed onto a narrative that placed Wales at the center of a key moment in the history of the world. Then this story became attractive to American settlers, who were less interested in the fact that this lost tribe was Welsh and more interested in the fact that they were white. As the legend grew, Madoc's tribe started to get credit for any bit of pre-contact architecture or engineering that was deemed, quote-unquote, too sophisticated to have been created by the true first people of the continent. The famous mounds of the Ohio Valley, well, they were surely created by Madoc's tribe. Various fortified places found along the Mississippi River, well, clearly they were of Welsh make. Some were even willing to speculate that the massive pyramids of Mexico and Central America were designed by Welsh settlers in 1170. Those that wanted to believe that light-skinned European people were the primary source for all civilization found the Madoc story useful. The achievements of indigenous people could be written off as secretly being the work of some lost group of white people. And even better, this lost tribe could be placed literally anywhere in North or South America to suit the needs of the mythmaker, as no one rightly knows exactly where Madoc supposedly landed. As the scholar Derek Spradlin has pointed out, quote, "The very mobility of the Madoc figure proves to be its greatest asset. For writers in different eras can imagine the Welshman and his progeny to have journeyed to any part of the continent's interior and to have had any kind of adventures on this journey. The value of the Madoc legend is, in fact, that the Welshman can be molded to fit the different needs of different authors. Madoc denotes Anglo-America's entitlement to the North American continent." End quote. This is how you get a plaque in Mobile, Alabama, celebrating the landing of Prince Madoc. When the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto first navigated to the mouth of the Mississippi, he encountered large fortified places made by the indigenous people of that area. Now, if you were interested in both undercutting the achievements of both the Spanish and the native people of the Mississippi Delta, you could claim that those forts were designed by the Welsh. You see, if Madoc landed in Mobile, then that means that the Spanish never had a good claim to Alabama. It also means that all of the ancient architecture found along the Mississippi was secretly the work of white people. In the 1950s, when the historical plaque was first erected, there were some in Alabama who liked the implications of the Madoc story. But we should still ask, how do you explain those 93 accounts of people meeting indigenous tribes who spoke Welsh? Well, there are a few explanations. First, when you dig into those encounters, you discover that many of them were reported secondhand. Someone heard of someone else meeting a Welsh tribe. When we look at the first-hand accounts that we have, we discover that many of them were written by people who did not speak Welsh. There are many cases where colonists met a group of indigenous people, could not understand their language, and then assumed that they were speaking Welsh. Welsh was as foreign to many of these people as Sioux or Anishinaabe, and so they misidentified what they were hearing. The Madoc myth encouraged these types of misidentifications. By the late 1600s, people had heard that there was this group of Welsh speakers out there in the American wilderness. When they encountered people speaking a language they did not understand, they half expected them to be speaking Welsh. The stories that feature real Welsh speakers actually communicating with Welsh-speaking tribes are, in fact, very few. And almost all of them follow the template set by the Reverend Morgan Jones. A man doomed to die speaks Welsh and is saved by his surprised Welsh-speaking captors. This story gets repeated again and again in our sources. In all likelihood, the Reverend Jones invented that original story, or hugely exaggerated a real event. We know that his story was very popular and was reprinted a number of times in magazines. It seems likely that other storytellers used the Reverend Jones experience as a template for their own tall tales about quote-unquote Welsh Indians. In this way, the Madoc myth seems to have birthed a whole genre of fake history. The story of Prince Madoc gave Europeans, especially Britons, a way to understand and interpret their interactions with indigenous people. Real interactions were seen through the lens of myth. Then the sheer volume of Welsh tribe stories made the original legend seem more plausible. It created a fascinating mythic feedback loop. So I think we can safely say that there was no Prince Madoc. And if there was, he most certainly did not bring hundreds of Welsh people across the Atlantic in the year 1170. But honestly, I still can't explain the penguins. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in just 1 week's time when I will be doing another bonus episode where I will be answering all of your questions about the last 2 episodes. So if you've got questions about Prince Madoc or you've got questions about elephant duels, please email me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Or if you are a patron, go to the patrons only chat and drop your questions into the correct chat feed. I also want to let everyone know that we've got some brand new designs up at the TeePublic store, including, at long last, the Lying Sex Witch t-shirt. The people wanted it, so I could not deny them any longer. All of the art that is featured on the t-shirts is done by our man Frank Fiorentino, the amazing artist who has been behind all of the artwork for this podcast since the very beginning. Frank is amazing. I love the guy. He's truly my only real collaborator in this whole endeavor, and so I want you to know that when you buy a t-shirt or a hat or a tote or a mug or anything else with the art on it, you are supporting Frank along with supporting the podcast. So if you want to check out that new merch, head to our TeePublic store by either going to ourfakehistory.com and following the links or going to teepublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. Before we go this week, I also need to give some very special shout-outs. Big ups to Gabs, to Thomas, to Aaron the Realtor, to JP Junk, to Stefano, to Analog B. Sorry, I couldn't swear. It's a family show. To Dave Moore, to Madeline, to Charlie Rose. I wonder if it's that Charlie Rose. To Christian Carson and to Kathy Pop. All of these folks have decided to pledge $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. If you are a patron, don't forget to go and vote on what you want the next patrons-only episode to be. Only about a third of you have voted, so let your voice be known. Right now, the Norse contact in North America is sort of running away with it, but that can change if you go and vote right now. You can find the poll at patreon.com/ourfakehistory. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. Find me on Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. Find me on YouTube, where I am putting out video shorts. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
This November, action is free on Pluto TV. Go on the run with Jack Reacher.
Every suspect was a trained killer.
Then buckle up for Drive, World War Z,
Every human being we save is one less to fight.
and Charlie's Angels.
Damn, I hate to fly.
Launch into sci-fi adventure with The Fifth Element and laugh through the mayhem in Tropic Thunder.
What is going on here?
All the thrills, all for free. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.